Okay, let's dive right into this. Society absolutely loves to tell us a very specific and honestly, incredibly expensive story about intelligence. We're told that becoming truly smart requires 12 years of primary school, 4 years of college, and maybe another 6 years of graduate school, stocked right on top of that. But if we're being completely honest with ourselves, sometimes following that exact path doesn't make you a genius. A lot of times, it just leaves you unemployed, highly frustrated, and deeply in debt. Though, to be fair, when you inevitably write a Reddit post complaining about the job market, you will be able to write it in absolutely perfect English. The truth we're unpacking in today's explainer is that becoming smart is actually far easier than you might think. Even if you suspect your genetics are working against you, compared to literally every other animal on this planet, your brain is completely overpowered. So today, we're going to look at how to properly harness it.
Now, I'm sure you've seen the incredibly vague advice that pops up online whenever you search for ways to get smarter. You know the drill. Eat a handful of blueberries because they're supposedly brain food. Drink black coffee. Get exactly 8 hours of sleep. Listen to classical music in the background. Look, these things sound lovely, but let's be real for a second. At a certain point, to actually become smart, you have to learn stuff. These passive internet hacks are so entirely philosophical that the only people who could probably extract real intelligence from them are Oprah or Socrates. The truth is, there are historical geniuses who spent their entire days hunched at a desk, running on maybe 2 to 4 hours of sleep a night. So we really need to abandon the copied and pasted advice and start looking at practical, active methods.
So, to fix that, here is our roadmap for today's explainer. First, escaping vague hacks. Second, the active practice rule. Third, the power of mental simulation. And finally, number 4, the ultimate practice tool. All right, let's jump straight into section 1, escaping vague hacks. Look, if you want to bypass the whole passive approach to getting smart, the absolute most important thing you need to start doing is reading. But what kind of reading? Well, there's a split between the two main types, and both serve a really unique purpose in making you smarter. On one hand, we have fiction. Fiction is fantastic because it naturally increases your reading speed, builds out a much stronger vocabulary, and frankly, reading a lot of dialogue can make you feel like you actually have friends. But if your goal is to casually drop incredibly interesting knowledge into everyday conversations, you are going to want to focus on nonfiction. Nonfiction is the absolute quickest route to sounding informed. You can literally read one solid history book and instantly come off to anyone in a conversation as a seasoned historical scholar. But there is a massive social grace required when you start acquiring all this nonfiction knowledge. It's all about how you deliver the facts you learn. Imagine someone says, "Crazy how we evolved from chimpanzees, right?" If you hit them with a condescending, "Well, actually, evolution is nonlinear and several human-like species inhabited Earth simultaneously, none of which were chimpanzees." Okay, you might be factually correct, but you sound obnoxious, instantly unlikable. It just makes the other person feel dumb. Instead, try changing that aggressive "well, actually" to a humble agreement. Something like, "It is crazy, right? You know, I was reading the other day and apparently humans and chimps just evolved side by side." It's the exact same intelligence, but delivered in a way that makes you sound humble, likable, and like you actually touch grass. You get to teach people what you know without making them feel inadequate, and that earns their respect. Which brings us to section 2, the active practice rule. Getting knowledge into your head from a book is really only half the battle. Because here's the thing, and this is the core thesis of our explainer today. Reading is totally, completely useless if your brain decides the information isn't worth keeping. There's this amazing rule of thumb that you only need 20% of the knowledge to master 80% of a given skill. You can make an incredible amount of progress right at the very beginning of learning something new. But there is a massive catch. The knowledge does not stick unless you actively apply it immediately. Think about it like this. No one, and I mean no one, ever learned how to tie a tie just by watching someone else tie a tie. You only ever truly learn by physically holding the fabric, looking in the mirror, watching someone else do it, and tying yours at the exact same time. Physical action is absolutely mandatory. And the exact same rule applies to reading books. Reading only makes you smarter if you give your brain a physical, tangible reason to remember the stuff printed on the page. So, we need a practical roadmap to actually retain information. It comes down to a 4-step escalation of active practice. First, you read the material. Second, you physically practice the skill. If you can't physically practice, you move to step 3, mentally simulate. And finally, you test yourself. This structure right here, it is the literal cheat code for signaling to your brain that the data it just absorbed is highly important for your survival, and therefore, absolutely must be moved into your long-term memory.
Let's ground this active practice mandate in mundane reality. Say you decide to read a book about the optimal ways to clean and organize. What should you do the exact moment you finish the chapter on cleaning a bedroom? You go clean a bedroom. It doesn't even have to be your own bedroom. Just go find one and clean it using the precise techniques you just read about. Because you physically applied the reading immediately, your brain permanently encodes the memory. If you don't use it, your brain literally thinks, well, we didn't use that, it must be useless, and tosses it right into the mental trash.
Let's move on to Section 3, the power of mental simulation. Because what happens when physical practice is literally impossible? Say you're reading a book about cars, and you see a detailed diagram on how to jumpstart a dead battery. Ideally, you'd run outside and practice. But let's be real, you probably don't have two cars just lying around your living room waiting to be experimented on. This is where mental simulation comes in. You actively and vividly visualize the scenario from start to finish. You put yourself right in that situation. Imagine the exact moment you'll need this knowledge. Pretend vividly that you are hooking up those jumper cables. By imagining the entire process step by step, you successfully trick your brain. You convinced it that you actually use the information. Meanwhile, the person who just stared passively at the diagram and tried to rote memorize it, they are going to be completely lost when their battery actually dies on the side of the highway. All right, final section, Section 4, the ultimate practice tool.
Believe it or not, the entire traditional school system is fundamentally built on this idea of tricking your brain. In school, you learn a piece of information, but it might be 15 years before you actually need to use it in the real world. Your brain naturally wants to forget it immediately. So what does a teacher do? They create an imaginary high-stakes situation where that information is suddenly vital. It's called an exam. If you get it wrong, you fail. The stakes trigger your memory. You can totally replicate this at home. If you want to remember biology, pretend you are literally hanging off a cliff by one arm, and someone will only pull you up if you can successfully name all the parts of a human cell. Create the stakes, force the recall, and your brain will hold on to that data.
And this perfectly highlights the difference between how most of us try to learn today versus how we actually should be learning. Casual learning is what most of us do on the internet. We watch incredibly fun, highly edited videos on complex topics. We feel like absolute geniuses for about 20 minutes, and then we forget absolutely all of it an hour later because there was no active practice. Compare that to S-tier learning, the absolute peak format for getting smart fast. Textbooks with rigorous practice questions. I know, it advocates for the one thing most people absolutely hate. But textbooks are undeniably S-tier because there is zero fluff, there is no hand-holding, there are no pop-up distractions or algorithms desperately trying to show you a cat video. It is pure, dense information. But most importantly, textbooks have built-in practice questions. They perfectly simulate the exact situations in which you need to use the knowledge. If you can't solve the questions, you are forced to flip all the way to the appendix to figure it out. It is active, it's rigorous, and it is highly, highly effective. So we arrive at the ultimate question. You know now that generic internet hacks won't save you, and that passively scrolling through information without applying it physically or mentally is just a massive waste of your incredible brain power. The blueprint to actually becoming smart is active, focused practice. So I leave you with this. Are you ready to stop reading passively and start putting your brain to the test with the very next thing you learn today? Get out there, find a textbook, create some high stakes, and force your brain to get smarter.